The coat had been in a garbage bag for 3 days. It was the kind of coat that had lived through too many winters. A dark green parka with a broken zipper pull and a fraying hem that Rosa had safety pinned twice without anyone noticing. She had bought it at a church sale 4 years ago for $2, back when $2 still felt like a reasonable amount to spend on herself. Now it sat crumpled at the top of the garbage bag that held everything she owned, along with her daughter's clothes, 3 mismatched towels, and a shoebox containing the things she could not bring herself to throw away even now. A birthday card from her mother, a photograph taken at the beach the summer before everything fell apart, and a small plastic trophy her oldest daughter Camille had won at a spelling bee in 3rd grade. So Rosa sat on the edge of the plastic chair in the lobby of the Millfield community shelter and stared at the row of identical chairs across from her, all empty in the thin gray light of a Tuesday morning. Her younger daughter, Lily, 6 years old, and already expert at reading silence, had fallen asleep against her arm with her face tucked into Rosa's shoulder. Camille, 11, sat 2 seats down with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes fixed on the scuffed tile floor as though she were reading something important written there that no one else could see. They had left the apartment on Saturday. The sheriff had come at 8 in the morning with a deputy and a sheet of paper that Rosa had already read 14 times in the weeks before it arrived, hoping each reading would reveal a mistake, a loophole, as a misunderstanding that could dissolve the whole thing back into nothing. There was no mistake. 14 months of barely met rent, then 3 months of not met at all after the cleaning company let her go, and the warehouse job fell through, and the unemployment claim got tangled in a system that seemed designed to discourage the people who needed it most. The math had stopped working before she had the words to describe how badly it had stopped working, and by the time she understood just how far behind she had fallen, the number on the paper from the sheriff's office made her stomach hollow. She had called her sister in Phoenix. Her sister had a 1-bedroom apartment and a boyfriend who had made clear, without ever saying the exact words, marked that there was no room and no welcome for Rosa and 2 children, and whatever disaster had followed her here. She had called the woman she used to work with at the cleaning company, a woman named Deirdre, who had always been kind, and who now answered with a warmth that remained firmly on the other side of a glass wall Rosa could not break through. She had called the church where she had bought the coat, and they had given her the shelter address and a list of phone numbers printed on a yellow sheet that she carried in her jacket pocket, like a second heart she had not yet learned to use. The shelter was full. That was what the woman at the front desk had told her on Saturday, with the kind of practiced sympathy that Rosa recognized as the face people put on when they had delivered the same news so many times that empathy had been sanded smooth into something more manageable. There were no beds available. They could sleep in the lobby for 1 night. There might be space after the weekend. Rosa had nodded, gathered her daughters close, and sat down in the plastic chairs where they had now been sitting, on and off, for 3 days. Lily stirred against her arm. Rosa shifted slightly to keep her comfortable and looked at Camille, who had not complained once. Not about the food from the paper bags the volunteers distributed twice a day. Not about the hard chairs. Not about the fluorescent light overhead that buzzed faintly at a frequency that seemed designed to make sleep impossible. Camille had simply gone quiet in the way that children go quiet when they understand that the adults around them are carrying something fragile, and they have decided, without being asked, to help carry it by adding nothing to the weight. Rosa loved her daughters with a ferocity that sometimes felt like the only thing keeping her upright. She had been a good mother. She believed this, needed to believe it. But goodness had turned out not to be a sufficient shield against the world. She had worked hard. She had made decisions that seemed reasonable when she made them. She had stayed. She had tried. And still, here they were. She reached into the pocket of her coat to find the yellow sheet of phone numbers, thinking she would look at it again even though she had memorized it by now, just to have something to do with her hands. Her fingers touched the sheet, and then, below it, something else. A small object, hard and flat, that she did not recognize by touch alone. She pulled it out. It was a key. She turned it over in her fingers. It was not her key. She knew every key she owned, which at this point was none, since the apartment keys had been surrendered to the sheriff along with everything else. This was an older key, heavier than a house key, with a round plastic tag attached to a wire loop. The plastic was yellowed and slightly brittle, the kind of tag that had been made cheaply and stored a long time. On one side, in faded black ink, was a number, 114. On the other side, printed in smaller fading letters, for the words, self-store. The rest of the word had worn away, but the shape of it was clear enough. A storage unit key. Rosa turned it over again in her palm and thought about the coat. She had bought it 4 years ago. She had never cleaned out the pockets when she got it. She remembered meaning to and never doing it, the way she never did a dozen small things that fell below the threshold of urgency. She thought about who might have owned it before her, who might have worn it, and left a key in the pocket and then brought it to a church sale and never thought to look for it again. She thought about the number 114 and what might be inside a storage unit that someone had owned long enough to lose the key and then forgotten or abandoned. She thought about how this key had been in her pocket through the eviction and the walk to the shelter and the 3 days of sitting in plastic chairs, and she had not known it was there. Lily stirred again and opened her eyes, blinking at the fluorescent light. She looked up at Rosa with an expression that contained a question she did not voice, and Rosa smoothed her hair back and said quietly that it was okay, that they were fine, that she should rest. Camille looked over. Her gaze moved to the key in Rosa's hand. "What's that?" "I found it in my coat pocket," Rosa said. "It's a key to a storage unit." Camille studied it with the careful attention she gave to most things. "Whose is it?" "I don't know. Someone who had this coat before me, I think." "What's in the unit?" Rosa looked at the key again. I don't know that either." There was a silence. Then Camille said, with the particular bluntness of an 11-year-old who had spent 3 days in a shelter lobby, "It could be something useful." Rosa did not say anything to that, but she did not put the key back in her pocket. She held it in her hand, and for the first time in several days, she felt something that was not quite hope. Hope had become too expensive, too risky, but something adjacent to it, a flicker of possibility so small that she was almost afraid to look at it directly in case looking made it go out. She had nothing to go back to. She had nowhere else to be. And somewhere in this city, behind a metal door with the number 114 on it, something waited. She looked at the key for a long time. Then she looked at her daughters. Then she made a decision. The storage facility was called Millfield Self-Storage, and it sat on the eastern edge of the industrial district, about 1.5 miles from the shelter, past the car repair place and the discount grocery and the strip of boarded-up retail that had once been a video rental store and then a dollar store and then nothing at all. Rosa had passed it 100 times without giving it a second thought. It was the kind of place that existed in the background of a city, the way certain sounds exist in the background of a house, present and unnoticed until the day they stop. She went on Wednesday morning. She left Lily and Camille at the shelter with a volunteer named Margaret, who had grandchildren of her own, and who pressed Rosa's hand warmly when she said she had an errand to run and would be back within the hour. She walked the 1.5 miles in the cold, hands in her pockets, the key in her right hand, and the yellow phone sheet in her left, though she wasn't thinking about the phone sheet. The facility was ordinary. A gate, a small office with a sliding glass window, rows of orange metal doors stretching back in long corridors behind a chain-link fence. A sign by the entrance listed the hours and the phone number, and a warning about no overnight access. A rusted padlock display hung on the office wall, beside a chart of available unit sizes. The woman in the office was in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the look of someone who had been doing this job long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything. Rosa showed her the key through the glass, explained that she had come across it and believed the unit might have been abandoned. The woman looked at the key, then at Rosa, then at the tag. Unit 114. She typed something into a computer that had the look of a machine that had outlasted several operating systems. She scrolled. She scrolled some more. Then she leaned back slightly and said, with a tone that was not unkind, but carried the distinct weight of institutional procedure, that Unit 114 had been registered to a woman named Eleanor Marsh, that the last payment on record was 11 months ago, and that the unit had subsequently been flagged for default auction. However, she continued, the auction had not yet taken place because there was a note in the system from an attorney's office indicating a possible claim on the unit from the estate of the original owner, who had apparently passed away. The note was over a year old, and no follow-up had occurred, which meant the file had been sitting in what the woman called, with a slight weariness, a legal gray zone. Rosa asked what that meant for someone who had a key. The woman looked at the key again. "Key's the original," she said after a moment. "See, the tag number matches. We don't make copies of these, so if you've got it, you've got it." She paused. "I can't let you remove anything until the estate claim clears, but I can let you go in and look. Just look. We do that sometimes. Lets us assess whether it needs to go to auction or whether there's anything worth noting." She paused again, as if weighing something. "You look like you could use a bit of luck." Rosa said nothing to that. She just nodded. The woman came out from behind the office with a clipboard and walked her back through the rows of orange doors. The corridors were quiet except for the sound of their footsteps and the distant hum of traffic beyond the fence. The numbers were painted on the doors in black above the locks. They went down the first corridor, turned left, and stopped halfway down the second row. 114. The door was the same as all the others. Orange metal, slightly dented, a padlock hasp on the front. Rosa fit the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism was stiff with age, but gave way with a grinding reluctance. She rolled the door up. The smell came first. Not mildew exactly. More like time itself had a smell. Dry and papery and faintly sweet. The smell of things that had been sealed away for years. The light from the corridor fell in at a low angle and showed her a space perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, stacked and arranged with an order that surprised her. Whoever had packed this unit had not thrown things in. They had organized. Boxes were labeled in a careful hand. Furniture was wrapped in quilted moving blankets. A wardrobe stood against the back wall, with its doors banded shut by a strip of packing tape. Beside it, a stack of flat wooden frames, wrapped in brown paper, stood upright, leaning against the wall. It was not the chaos of abandonment. It was the organization of someone who had planned to come back. Rosa stood at the entrance for a long moment, the woman from the office standing a respectful few feet behind her with the clipboard. She looked at the labels on the boxes nearest the door. Kitchen, china, the dining, linens, office, files, living room, books, and one near the back, labeled simply, personal. E. She did not go inside. She only looked, but her eyes moved across every visible surface, taking inventory, trying to understand the shape of what she was seeing. It was a life. A whole life, packed into a 12-by-8 space with care and intention by someone who had not expected it to stay there as long as it had. "Do you know anything about her?" Rosa asked, without turning around. "The woman who owned this, Eleanor Marsh." The clipboard woman was quiet for a moment. "I've been here 17 years, she said. "Eleanor came in about 8 years ago. Came herself, no movers, which was unusual for this much stuff. Made 3 trips over 2 days with a rented van. She was, I don't know, maybe late 70s? Elegant. The kind of person who you could tell had been used to a certain kind of life." A pause. "She came back once to add something, maybe 2 years later. After that, nothing. When the payment stopped, we sent letters. Sent certified mail to the address on file. The mail came back, returned to sender. That's when we found out she'd passed." Rosa nodded slowly. "She seemed like she had nobody left," the woman said. "Nobody ever came." Rosa looked at the box labeled personal, E, and felt something she could not name, something between sorrow and recognition. The loneliness of a life packed into boxes that no one came to claim. She did not touch anything. She rolled the door back down and locked it, and thanked the woman, and walked back out to the street. On the walk back to the shelter, she thought about Eleanor Marsh. She thought about the coat and the key. She thought about the way the unit had been organized, the care in the labeling, the wrapped furniture, the flat frames standing upright against the wall. She did not know what was in those frames yet. She did not know what was in the box labeled personal, E. But she thought about how long the unit had been sitting there, and how nobody had come, and how a key had ended up in the pocket of a coat at a church sale, and how she had carried it, without knowing it, through the worst days of her life, until the moment she had nothing left to lose, and reached into her pocket and found it. She was not a superstitious person. She had grown up in a household where superstition was considered a luxury that sensible people could not afford. But something about the weight of the key in her hand felt purposeful in a way she could not dismiss. Not magical, not miraculous, just purposeful, as if the sequence of events that had brought it to her required her to do something with it rather than put it back. When she reached the shelter, Lily ran to her from across the lobby and pressed her face into Rosa's coat. Rosa held her and looked over her head at Camille, who was watching with the careful eyes she had developed over these past months, eyes that had learned to read Rosa's face for information she might not yet have the words to deliver. "Anything?" Camille asked. Rosa thought about a storage unit on Millfield's east side, packed with the careful remains of someone else's life. She thought about boxes and wrapped furniture and flat frames leaning against a wall. And she thought about a legal gray zone and an estate with no claimants, and a key that had found its way to her. "Maybe," she said. The attorney's name was Bernard Holt, and he had an office above a dry cleaning shop on Carver Street that smelled faintly of solvent even through the closed door at the top of the stairs. Rosa found his name through the storage facility. The woman at the office, whose name turned out to be Pat, had given it to her after Rosa came back the next morning and asked, with a directness that surprised even herself, whether there was any way to find out the status of the estate claim. Pat had looked at her for a moment across the sliding window, and something in Rosa's face, the shelter pallor of it, the careful composure, the daughters visible just behind her, Lily holding Camille's hand, seemed to settle a decision Pat had been weighing without realizing she was weighing it. She wrote the attorney's name and number on a post-it from her own desk and slid it under the window without comment. Bernard Holt turned out to be a man in his late 60s who practiced what he described, with mild self-deprecation, as small account estate law, which he said meant he handled the affairs of people who had died without enough to warrant the attention of larger firms, but not so little as to leave nothing worth administering. He had a desk covered in files, organized in a way that only he understood, a habit of looking at his hands when he was thinking, and a patience that Rosa had not anticipated. He already knew the file. Eleanor Marsh had been his client. He had filed the estate claim on the storage unit because among Eleanor's modest affairs, a small bank account, some jewelry, a few pieces of furniture already handled. There had been specific mention in her handwritten notes of items she had placed in storage that she considered to be of value, though she had not specified what kind of value or to what degree. There had been no family. Eleanor had been widowed young, before children, and had outlived every sibling by decades. The estate was technically unclaimed. He had been waiting, without much expectation, to determine whether any distant heir might surface before the facility proceeded with auction. Rosa placed the key on his desk. She told him where she had gotten the coat and how she had found the key and what Pat had told her about the unit, and that she had stood at the open door and looked in without touching anything. Holt picked up the key and turned it in his fingers, much as Rosa had done in the shelter lobby. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at Rosa. "You could have sold this key," he said, not accusingly, just observing. "I thought about it," Rosa said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. "You could have waited for the auction and bid on it legitimately. Could have gotten it for pennies if you were the only bidder." "I know. Instead, you came here." "Yes." He set the key down and looked at his hands for a moment. "Ms. Castillo, I've been practicing law for 41 years. In my experience, the number of people who discover an unclaimed asset and immediately go find the lawyer for the estate is small enough that I can count them without removing my shoes." He paused. "It's an unusual thing you've done." Rosa did not say anything. She looked at her hands. "The estate is unclaimed," Holt continued. "Eleanor had no heirs and no specific named beneficiaries. What she had was a handwritten document, not a formal will. It wasn't witnessed properly to be binding, but it stated her wishes clearly. And in that document, she wrote that she hoped whatever remained of her belongings would go to someone who needed them, since the people she might have wanted to give them to were gone." He paused again. "She also wrote, and I'm telling you this because I think it's relevant, that she had spent most of her life regretting what she held on to too tightly, and that she hoped whoever came after her would not make the same mistake." Rosa felt something shift in her chest. "I'm going to be honest with you," Holt said. "The legal process for transferring the contents of that unit to you as an unrelated party without a formal will is not simple. It will take time. There are procedures and filings, and a period of notice that needs to run in case any heir does emerge, however unlikely." He folded his hands. "But I'm also going to tell you that if you want me to begin that process, I will. Pro bono. Because Eleanor was a good woman who died with no one to receive what she'd kept, and because you're someone who found a key in a coat pocket and went looking for the right person to give it to." Rosa sat very still. "It might be nothing in that unit," Holt said. "Old furniture and dishes and books. I want to be honest about that too." "I know," Rosa said, "but it might not be." She nodded. He opened a drawer, took out a form, and began to fill it in. They sat together in the office above the dry cleaner on Carver Street for another hour, and Rosa answered every question he asked, and when she left, she had nothing materially different than when she had walked in. No money, no promises, no roof. She still had 2 daughters sleeping in a shelter. She still had nothing. But she had the feeling, quiet and dangerous, of a thread in her hand. The waiting was the hardest part. Rosa knew how to wait. She had spent her adult life waiting for promotions that did not come, waiting for a father who did not stay, waiting for the unemployment office to process what it was going to process, waiting for the world to arrange itself into something survivable. But this waiting had a different quality. This waiting had a shape and a direction, and it pressed against her ribs from the inside. The shelter found them beds within the week. A family had moved on, and there were 2 narrow cots in a room shared with 2 other families, a curtain drawn between each section for privacy. It was not privacy. Not really, but it was walls and warmth and a door that closed, and Lily slept through the whole first night without waking, which she had not done since the eviction, and Rosa lay awake next to her in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Unit 114. She went back twice while the process ran. Pat let her in both times, clipboard in hand, and standing at a respectful distance, while Rosa stood at the open door and looked at the organized rows of boxes and the wrapped furniture and the flat frames leaning against the wall. She still did not go in. She did not feel that she had the right yet. But she looked, and she tried to read the shape of Eleanor Marsh's life from what she could see. There was a typewriter on a small wooden table near the door, its case closed, but its presence deliberate, as if Eleanor had packed it last and wanted it accessible. On top of the case was a small notepad, and on the notepad, in the same careful hand as the box labels, a single line had been written: "Do not be afraid to open things." Rosa read that line 6 times before she accepted that it was there. She told Camille about the storage unit on the 3rd night in the shelter beds, on after Lily had fallen asleep. She had not told her before, not wanting to build something up in the child's imagination that might come to nothing. But Camille was 11 and had her mother's habit of reading silences, and she had known something was happening without being told. Camille listened to the whole story in the half-dark of the shelter room without interrupting. When Rosa finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you think is in the frames?" Rosa looked at the ceiling. "I don't know. Paintings, maybe. Maybe. Or mirrors. Maybe." Camille was quiet again. Then she said, with the careful precision she used when she was working something out, "Mom, if you found the key in the coat and the coat was donated to the church, fine, and the church is like 4 blocks from the storage place, whoever donated the coat probably lived near there, right?" Rosa looked at her daughter in the dark. "And if they lived near there," Camille continued, "they probably knew about the storage place, which means the key didn't end up in the coat by accident. Someone put it there." The thought settled slowly into Rosa's chest, like something finding its proper weight. "Or they forgot it," Rosa said. Camille considered this. "Yeah," she said, "or they forgot it." But her tone suggested she found the first explanation more interesting. Rosa lay there for a long time after Camille fell asleep, thinking about a woman named Eleanor, who had packed her life into a 12-by-8 space with care and intention, and left a note on a typewriter case that said, "Do not be afraid to open things." And she thought about the coat traveling from wherever Eleanor had lived to a church sale to Rosa's back for 4 years. She thought about the key riding in the pocket through rain and cold, and the worst days Rosa had known, waiting. She did not sleep much that night. But she did not feel afraid, which was its own kind of rest. The call from Holt came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after their first meeting. Rosa stepped outside the shelter to take it, standing on the front steps in the cold, with her hand pressed against her other ear to block out the street noise. He was brief. The notice period had run without response. The estate petition had cleared. The contents of Unit 114 at Millfield self-storage were legally hers. She stood on the steps for a moment after he said it, and looking at the street and the trees stripped bare by November and a yellow cab moving through the intersection in the distance, she had expected the news to feel enormous. Instead, it felt quiet, like a held breath finally released. She called the shelter volunteer coordinator and arranged for someone to stay with the girls. She found Pat at the office on Millfield's east side and shook her hand and told her the estate had cleared. Pat smiled in a way that reached all the way to her eyes and gave Rosa 2 pairs of cotton gloves for handling things, because, she said, you never knew. She offered the use of a flat cart and said Rosa should take her time. Rosa stood in front of door 114 one more time. She turned the key. She rolled the door up. The light fell in at the same low angle as before, and the same smell came forward, papery and dry and faintly sweet. But this time, Rosa did not stand at the threshold. She pulled on one of the cotton gloves and stepped inside. She started at the front, the way Eleanor had arranged things, so the door-adjacent boxes were labeled for easy access. Kitchen, china. She lifted the lid gently. Inside, each piece wrapped individually in white tissue paper, was a set of bone china, the kind that looked expensive even with the naked eye, thin as an eggshell, rimmed in a pattern of fine gold and cobalt blue, the kind of pattern Rosa could not identify, but that radiated a specific quality of care. She counted 12 place settings, every piece intact. She set the lid back and moved deeper. The box labeled Office, Files was heavy. Inside, under a layer of neatly folded cloth, were folders organized by year, tax documents, correspondence, and beneath those, a manila envelope labeled simply, Provenance Records. Rosa took off the glove and looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. Inside were documents, a series of papers, some very old, some more recent, all concerning what appeared to be items in a collection. Her eye caught phrases: certificate of authenticity, acquisition record, museum correspondence, exhibition catalog, appraised value. She read the first page of the top document carefully. It was a letter from an institution in New York, addressed to an Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux at an address Rosa did not recognize, dated 16 years ago. The letter confirmed receipt of a loan agreement for 3 paintings from the Marsh-Devereaux collection for an upcoming exhibition. It referenced, in the dry institutional language of such correspondence, the appraised insurance value of the 3 pieces. Rosa read the number twice. She sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit, with the paper in her hand, and the walls of Eleanor Marsh's carefully packed life surrounding her on all sides, and she read the number a 3rd time. The 3 paintings referenced in the letter, only 3, on loan to a New York museum 16 years ago, had been appraised at the time for insurance purposes at a combined value of $2.4 million. Rosa sat very still. She looked up from the paper, and her gaze moved slowly to the row of flat wooden frames, wrapped in brown paper, leaning against the back wall. She counted them. There were 11. She read the provenance letter again from the beginning. Then she found the next document in the envelope and read that. Then the next. By the time she understood what she was looking at, the late afternoon light had changed, and the corridor outside the unit had gone quieter around her, and she had been sitting on the concrete floor for 2 hours. She had found the thread. Now she was beginning to understand where it led. She sat there for a long time in the gathering quiet of the storage corridor, the provenance envelope in her lap, the cotton gloves on the floor beside her, the 11 wrapped frames against the wall. The cold concrete pressed through her jeans. The key to Unit 114 sat on the box, labeled Kitchen, china beside her right hand. She picked it up and turned it over, and looked at the number 114. And she thought about Eleanor Marsh packing this room with intention, labeling every box, setting the notepad on the typewriter with its one instruction, and then never coming back. She thought about the coat at the church sale, and the key in the pocket, and the 3 days in plastic chairs, and the decision to walk 1.5 miles to a storage facility on a cold morning with nothing left to lose. She did not cry. She was too still for that, too held inside the weight of what she was beginning to understand. She pulled out her phone. She called Bernard Holt. When he answered, she said, in a voice that was steady because she needed it to be steady, that she thought he ought to come to the storage unit as soon as he could, because she believed Eleanor Marsh's collection might be more significant than either of them had anticipated. She heard the pause on his end of the line. Then he said he would be there in 20 minutes. Rosa set the phone down in her lap and looked at the 11 wrapped frames against the wall and the boxes arranged with such care around her, and she let herself feel, just for a moment, the full impossible weight of what had found her. Not what she had found, what had found her. Outside, the street hummed with the ordinary noise of a city going about its evening. Inside Unit 114, surrounded by the carefully preserved life of a woman she had never met, Rosa Castillo sat on a concrete floor with a key in her hand and felt the future, for the first time in a very long time, lean toward her like light through an opening door. She would not rush it. She would not panic or reach for it too fast. She would wait for Holt, and she would be careful. Oh, and she would do this the right way. The way Eleanor, from the evidence of everything around her, had seemed to believe things ought to be done, with intention, with care, and with the courage to open what was waiting to be opened. The key was warm in her hand now. She held it and waited for the 20 minutes to pass. Bernard Holt arrived in 19 minutes. Rosa heard his footsteps in the corridor before she saw him, the careful, measured tread of a man who had learned not to move quickly through other people's crises. He appeared in the doorway of Unit 114, with his coat still on, and his reading glasses already in his hand, and he looked at Rosa, sitting on the floor, and at the envelope in her lap, and at the room around her, and he said nothing for a moment. I just took it in the way a person takes in a landscape that turns out to be larger than anticipated. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. Rosa held out the provenance envelope without getting up. He took it, unfolded his glasses onto his nose, and began to read. She watched his face. He was the kind of man who had trained himself not to show reactions in front of clients, but the training showed strain around the second page. By the third, he had sat down on the nearest box, Kitchen, China, which held 12 settings of bone china worth more than Rosa had earned in her last full year of employment, without seeming to notice he had done it. He read through the entire envelope before he looked up. When he did, his expression had settled into something careful and deliberate, the face of a man assembling his thoughts before he released them into the air. "Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux," he said. "Yes," Rosa said. "I saw the full name in the museum letter. I knew her as Eleanor Marsh. She dropped the Devereaux decades ago, after her husband passed." He looked back at the first document. "I knew she had collected. She mentioned it in the way she mentioned things, obliquely, as if she thought the details would bore people. I had no idea of the scale." He paused. "I don't think she wanted anyone to know the scale." Rosa looked at the frames against the wall. "There are 11 of them." Holt followed her gaze. "The 3 on loan to the museum. Were they returned?" "There's a receipt in the back of the envelope. They were returned 8 years ago, which is when she rented this unit." Rosa had pieced it together while waiting for him. Eleanor had moved the entire collection into storage in what turned out to be the last coherent period of her life, had packed it herself with the precision of someone who trusted no one else to do it correctly, had paid the rent for years, and then had not. Holt set the envelope on his knee and looked at the room with new eyes. "The paintings are the largest question," he said. "But even before we get to those," he gestured at the boxes, the wardrobe, the wrapped objects on the shelves, "the secondary collection alone could be significant. The china, the correspondence, the furniture. If Eleanor's taste ran to what her provenance documents suggest, nothing in here is ordinary." Rosa had already understood this, but hearing it said aloud in the measured language of a man who chose words carefully gave it a different weight. "What do we do first?" she asked. "We document everything before we move anything," Holt said. "Photographs of every item in situ, before the unit is disturbed. Then we get an appraiser. Not a general estate appraiser, a specialist. Someone with expertise in the period and type of art suggested by these documents. He tapped the envelope. This will take time, and it will require patience. Rosa looked at him evenly. I've been patient, she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He nodded. I know you have. He spent the next 30 minutes on his phone, moving carefully around the edges of the unit without touching anything, making calls in a low voice. Rosa sat and listened and let him work. She had the particular stillness of a person who has learned that the moments right before a large thing happens require the conservation of energy. When he finished, he told her he had reached a colleague who specialized in American and European art from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wren, who consulted for several major auction houses and who could come within the week. He had also called a documentation service that could be on site the following morning. Rosa nodded. She looked at the frames one more time before she rolled the door down for the night. 11 flat shapes wrapped in brown paper, leaning against the back wall with the patience of things that had been waiting a very long time for someone to look. So she locked Unit 114 and put the key in her pocket and walked back to the shelter in the dark. The documentation team came the next morning, 2 people with cameras and a laptop and a systematic approach that Rosa found deeply comforting in its thoroughness. They went through the unit shelf by shelf, box by box, photographing everything in place before anyone lifted or moved a single item. Rosa watched from the doorway, arms folded against the cold, and tried to read the expressions on their faces for information. They gave her nothing. They were professional in the way that instruments are professional. The photographs took 4 hours. When they left, they had 1,200 images and a preliminary catalog that listed item categories without assessments: textiles, ceramics, furniture, framed works, archival documents, decorative objects. The framed works section said, simply, 11 items, sizes approximate, contents undetermined, pending unwrapping. Rosa read those 3 words, contents undetermined, pending unwrapping, and felt them in her chest like a hand pressing gently against a bruise. She had been inside that unit 3 times now. She had stood within arm's reach of those frames. She had not yet allowed herself to imagine exactly what they were, because imagining had started to feel dangerous, like looking directly at something bright. She told Camille about the appraiser that evening, sitting on the shelter cot, while Lily colored at the small table the room shared. Camille listened the way she always listened, completely, without interruption, her eyes tracking Rosa's face with the attentiveness of a person who knows that important information sometimes hides inside the ordinary words used to deliver it. When Rosa finished, Camille said, "What kind of paintings are they?" "I don't know yet. But they were in a museum. 3 of them were, yes, on loan." Camille considered this. If they were in a museum, she said carefully, they must be the real kind. Rosa looked at her daughter. The real kind, as opposed, she understood, to the decorative prints and mass-produced canvases that hung on the walls of the apartments they had lived in. Pleasant, purchased, meaningless in the way that objects are meaningless when they are bought to fill a space rather than because they carry something inside them. "Yes," Rosa said, "I think they might be the real kind." Camille absorbed this without visible excitement, which Rosa had learned to read as the highest form of attention her daughter paid to things. "Okay," she said finally, and went back to watching Lily color. Rosa lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about 11 frames wrapped in brown paper, and the woman who had wrapped them, and the instruction written on the notepad: "Do not be afraid to open things." Dr. Patricia Wren arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after Rosa's first call to Holt. She drove herself, which surprised Rosa. She had expected someone with credentials sufficient to consult for auction houses to arrive with an entourage, or at least an assistant. Instead, there was a compact woman in her early 60s with short silver hair and paint-stained fingers that she made no effort to hide, wearing a coat that was expensive in the way of things purchased once and kept for decades. She shook Rosa's hand with a directness that asked for no performance in return, looked at the storage unit doorway, and said, "All right, let's begin." Holt was there as well, standing slightly to the side, in the manner of a man who understood that his role at this stage was to witness rather than participate. Pat from the office had found reasons to be in the corridor more than usual that morning. They began, at Dr. Wren's direction, with the documents, the provenance envelope, the correspondence, the acquisition records. She read through them with a speed that suggested she had been reading documents like these for a very long time, occasionally pausing to study a particular line or cross-reference a name with something in her memory. She asked Rosa 3 questions during this process: when the estate had cleared, whether any other documents had been found outside the unit, and whether Rosa had any knowledge of Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux prior to finding the key. Rosa answered all 3 honestly. Dr. Wren nodded at the 3rd answer in a way that was not skeptical, but attentive. Then she set the documents aside and looked at the frames. "Shall we?" she said. She approached the frames the way Rosa imagined a surgeon approaches the first incision, with a settled focus that had passed through any nervousness long ago and come out the other side as something purely functional. She lifted the first frame from the group and carried it to the flat cart Pat had provided, laying it face up. She produced a small penknife from her coat pocket and began, with practiced care, to cut the tape holding the brown paper in place. Rosa watched from 3 feet away. She could feel Holt beside her, very still. The paper came away in sections, and underneath it, gradually, was a canvas in a gilded frame, its surface dark with age in the way of old varnish, its image emerging slowly as the wrapping fell away, a landscape, expansive and deeply shadowed, with a quality of light in the upper left corner that seemed to press forward from the paint itself, as if it had somewhere to be. Dr. Wren stood back and looked at it without speaking for a long moment. Then she crouched and looked at the lower right corner of the canvas. Then she stood again. "What do you see?" Rosa asked, because the silence had become a specific kind of silence that required a question to open it. "I see what I expected to see," Dr. Wren said, in the measured tone of a person being careful not to outrun the evidence. Based on the provenance documents and the museum correspondence, I was already forming a picture of what Eleanor's collection might contain. This is consistent with that picture. She paused. "Would you like me to be specific?" "Please," Rosa said. Dr. Wren looked at the canvas again. "Now, this appears to be, and I stress appears pending full verification, an American landscape from the late 19th century, consistent with the Hudson River School tradition. The technique, the palette, the handling of light, all are consistent with major practitioners of the period." She paused again, a longer pause this time. "There are artists within that tradition whose work at auction, in recent years, has achieved prices in the range of $300,000 to $800,000 per canvas, depending on authenticity, provenance, and condition." Rosa heard Holt exhale very quietly beside her. "That's one painting," Rosa said. "That's one painting," Dr. Wren confirmed. She rewrapped it carefully and moved to the second frame. They spent the entire day in Unit 114. Dr. Wren unwrapped each frame with the same methodical care, so I examined it, noted her preliminary observations, and rewrapped it. She did not rush. She did not perform excitement or attempt to manage Rosa's expectations with either inflation or deflation. She simply moved through the 11 frames with the focused attention of someone doing important work, and Rosa stood nearby and watched and tried to keep her breathing even. The second canvas was smaller than the first. An interior scene, a figure at a table near a window. The light again extraordinary, pressing through the painted glass with a warmth that Rosa felt in her chest before she fully processed it with her eyes. Dr. Wren studied the back of the canvas as carefully as the front, examining the stretcher, the aging of the linen, a faint inscription in pencil on the upper cross member. The third was a portrait, a woman in dark clothing, on three-quarter view, her gaze directed slightly past the viewer in a way that created the disconcerting sensation of being seen without being looked at directly. The surface had a crackle pattern in the varnish that Dr. Wren studied at length with a small magnifying loupe she produced from an inside pocket. By the fourth frame, Rosa had begun to understand the shape of what she was inside. Not the financial shape. She was keeping that at arm's length deliberately because it was too large to look at full on. But the human shape. These were objects that a person had spent a lifetime finding and acquiring and caring for. Objects that carried within them the record of their own creation, the hand of a specific person on a specific day in a specific quality of light. Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux had loved these things. The care with which they had been wrapped was the evidence of that love, preserved in brown paper and cotton, batting against the day when someone would come. The seventh frame stopped Dr. Wren. She unwrapped it slowly, took it to the light at the unit doorway, the first time she had moved any of the canvases to the doorway, and stood there with it for several minutes without speaking. She looked at the front. She looked at the back. She looked at the front again. She produced a second tool from her coat, a small ultraviolet pen light, and moved it across the surface in a slow grid pattern, studying what it revealed. Rosa did not ask. She had developed, over the course of the day, the instinct that certain silences in Dr. Wren needed to complete themselves before they could be broken. Finally, the appraiser turned. Her face had changed in a way that Rosa could not precisely categorize. It was not excitement exactly, or if it was excitement that had been processed through 40 years of professional discipline and had come out the other side as something quieter and more certain. "Tell me," Rosa said. "The provenance documents mention a single painting by name," Dr. Wren said. "In the museum correspondence, it is referred to as the centerpiece of the Marsh-Devereaux collection. I recognized the description when I read it, because I have written about this particular work, or rather, about the question of this particular work." Rosa waited. "There are paintings," Dr. Wren said, "that disappear. Not stolen, not destroyed, simply lost. Private sales between families over generations. Estates settled without full inventory, and collections dispersed before cataloging was systematic. The art world has a phrase for them. They are called sleepers." She held the canvas in the doorway light. "This painting has been a documented sleeper for 31 years. It was last publicly recorded in the collection of a New York family in 1993. The family dispersed the estate, and this work was not accounted for in the sale records. The assumption was that it had been sold privately. It was known to have passed at some point through the hands of a private collector." She looked at Rosa. "Eleanor," Rosa said, "almost certainly. The provenance documents in your envelope include a purchase record for a private acquisition in 1994 from the estate of a New York family. The description matches. If this is what I believe it is not simply a valuable painting. It is a significant rediscovery." She paused. "This will require laboratory confirmation, X-ray analysis, pigment sampling, dendrochronology if there is a panel involved. This is canvas, so different methods. It will take time." "But you think it's real," Rosa said. Dr. Wren looked at the painting one more time. "I've been doing this for 38 years, she said. "I have learned to be cautious with strong reactions. But yes, I think it is real." Rosa stood in the doorway of Unit 114 and looked at the canvas in Dr. Wren's hands and tried to understand what she was looking at. A painting. Pigment on linen stretched over wooden bars, framed in gilded wood, wrapped in brown paper, and kept in a storage unit on Millfield's east side for 8 years. And also, a sleeper, a rediscovery, a thing that had been lost and was now found. Because a coat had gone to a church sale with a key still in the pocket. She did not ask about the value, not yet. She was not ready for the number to be real. She nodded at Dr. Wren, and Dr. Wren nodded back, and they went back inside to finish the remaining 4 frames. The full preliminary assessment took 3 more days. Dr. Wren returned each day with her tools, and her notebooks, and her measured language, working through not just the paintings, but the secondary collection, the china, the decorative objects on the shelves, the contents of the wardrobe, the archival documents. She brought a colleague for the second day, a man named Hargrove, who specialized in decorative arts and who moved through the space with the same quiet attention as Dr. Wren, lifting objects briefly, examining their undersides, replacing them exactly where he had found them. Rosa came every day. She sat on the flat cart or stood near the doorway and watched and answered questions when questions were asked. She went back to the shelter each evening and ate the food the volunteers distributed, and sat on the cot and listened to Lily's breathing after she fell asleep, and thought about pigment on linen and the word sleeper. And a woman named Eleanor, who had packed her life into a storage unit with the care of someone who still believed the things inside it had somewhere to go. On the 4th day, Holt called a meeting. He, Rosa, Dr. Wren, and Hargrove sat in folding chairs that Pat had brought out from the office, arranged in a loose circle in the corridor outside Unit 114. The morning was cold, and the light was flat and specific, the kind of light that does not soften anything. Dr. Wren opened her notebook and read from it in the same measured tone she used for everything. Rosa listened and heard the shape of a life she had never known becoming legible. The 11 paintings, Dr. Wren said, ranged in period from approximately 1870 to 1940. 7 were American works. 3 were European, 2 French, 1 Dutch. 1, the 7th frame, the sleeper, was in a category of its own pending laboratory verification. But Dr. Wren was prepared to offer a preliminary insurance valuation range for the purposes of the estate documentation. She read out individual estimates for each work, speaking in the dry numerical language of professional appraisal. And Rosa listened and noted and did not react visibly to any individual number because she was keeping them separate in her mind, each one its own distinct fact, to be absorbed individually rather than added together all at once. When Dr. Wren reached the 7th painting, she paused before she read the number. It was the kind of pause that prepared a room rather than building suspense, the pause of a person choosing the right container for a large thing. The preliminary insurance estimate for the 7th painting, pending full laboratory authentication, was between $4 and $7 million. Rosa heard it. She registered it. She kept her face still. Dr. Wren continued. The secondary collection, the decorative objects, the china, the furniture, the archival documents, which were of some historical interest to institutions she had already identified, brought additional value. The total preliminary estimate for the complete contents of Unit 114, across all categories, she said, setting her notebook on her knee and looking at Rosa directly, fell in the range of $9 to $14 million. The corridor was quiet. Pat was visible at the far end of the row, pretending to check something on her clipboard, and not moving at all. Holt looked at his hands. Rosa looked at Dr. Wren. 9 to 14, Rosa said. Pending authentication of the 7th work, Dr. Wren said. If the laboratory results confirm what I believe them to be, the upper estimate adjusts upward. If authentication is partial or inconclusive, we are looking at the lower end of that range. She paused. Either way, what is sitting in Unit 114 is a collection of significant cultural and financial value. It has been sitting here for 8 years, and it is now yours. Rosa sat very still in the folding chair in the cold corridor and listened to the quiet around her and tried to locate inside herself the appropriate response to what she had just heard. She could not find one. Not because she felt nothing, but because what she felt was too large and too mixed, and too much the accumulation of everything that had led to this moment. The eviction, and the plastic chairs, and the yellow sheet of phone numbers, and the coat with the broken zipper pull, and the key in the pocket, and the 3 readings of the number in the museum letter, and the 11 frames against the wall, and Eleanor's instruction on the notepad, and Camille's voice in the dark of the shelter room, saying maybe someone put it there. She pressed her hands together in her lap. She breathed. "What do we do next?" she asked. And Holt, with the practiced calm of a man who had spent 41 years delivering life-altering information to people who then needed to know what to do next, opened his own folder and told her. The authentication process for the 7th painting took 11 weeks. Rosa learned more about art authentication in those 11 weeks than she had known in the sum total of her life before them. She learned about infrared reflectography, which could reveal underdrawings invisible to the naked eye. She learned about pigment analysis, which could confirm whether the chemical composition of the paint matched what would have been available in a given period. She learned about canvas dating, about provenance chains, about the difference between a fully authenticated work and a work authenticated with qualifications, and why the distinction mattered to collectors, institutions, and auction houses in ways that could move a number by millions. She learned these things because she asked questions, and Dr. Wren answered them. The appraiser had become, over the course of the weeks following the initial assessment, something Rosa did not have a precise word for. Not a friend, not exactly. The distance of professional relationship still present. But a person who had chosen to give Rosa real information rather than managed information, and who seemed to respect that Rosa intended to understand what was happening rather than simply receive its results. The laboratory that handled the physical analysis was at a university 3 hours away. Dr. Wren drove the painting herself, wrapped in its original brown paper, inside an additional layer of archival materials, secured in the back of a car that was considerably less modest than it first appeared. Rosa did not go. She waited. She spent those 11 weeks in motion. Holt had begun the formal legal process of transferring the estate, and there were documents to sign and offices to visit, and the particular bureaucratic patience required when a process has a fixed number of steps that cannot be shortened. She took a job, part-time, at a copy center 2 blocks from the shelter, typing and filing and using the phone with the particular competence of a person who has done office work in enough different places to be fluent in its universal language. The pay was modest but regular, and regular was what she needed. She and her daughters moved out of the shelter in the 8th week into a furnished room in a boarding house on Carver Street, 2 blocks from Holt's office. It cost more than the copy center job could easily cover, but Holt had arranged a small advance against the estate, proper, documented. Against the anticipated transfer value, that made the difference. The room had 2 beds and a window that faced east, and a radiator that knocked in the early morning hours with a sound that Lily decided, on the 2nd night, was someone sending a message in code. She spent a week trying to decode it before concluding that the message was probably just good morning, which Rosa thought was as reasonable an interpretation as any. Camille got a library card. It was the first thing she did after they moved into the room, walking the 4 blocks to the public library on a Saturday morning while Rosa was at work and coming back with 6 books and the look of a person who has found something they didn't know they needed. She spread them on the bed and read through the afternoon, and Rosa came home to find her still reading, Lily asleep beside her, with her head on Camille's leg, and the room full of the particular silence that exists when children are content. Rosa stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her daughters in the east-facing room and felt something move through her that she recognized after a moment as gratitude. Not the managed, performed gratitude that difficult circumstances sometimes demand, but the real kind, the kind that sits in the chest like warmth. She had not told them the full number yet. She had told Camille that the paintings appeared to be valuable and that the process was ongoing. Camille had nodded and asked if she could get a library card, and Rosa had said yes, and that had been the extent of the conversation about $9 to $14 million. Lily did not know anything beyond that Mama had found something important in a storage unit that used to belong to a woman named Eleanor, and that they were waiting to find out more, and that in the meantime they had a room with a window. Rosa had decided, deliberately and with forethought, not to make the number the story before the number was confirmed. She had watched people she knew over the years build their lives around anticipated money that did not arrive in the form anticipated, and she had seen what that did. She would not do that to her daughters. She would let the process complete itself, and then she would tell them what was real. But in the quiet of the early mornings, when the radiator sent its coded messages, and Lily slept, and Camille slept, and the east window lightened slowly through its stages of gray, Rosa let herself hold the possibility, not as a fact, but as something that had moved from impossibility to the realm of the plausible, and that was enough, for now, to change the quality of the dark. The call from Dr. Wren came on a Thursday morning in the 11th week at 7:42, while Rosa was getting Lily ready for school. She stepped into the hallway of the boarding house and pressed the phone against her ear and listened. Dr. Wren spoke for 6 minutes. Rosa did not interrupt. She stood in the hallway with her back against the wall and her free hand pressed flat against the plaster, anchoring herself, and she listened to the language of laboratory confirmation, the results of the infrared analysis, the pigment study, the canvas dating, the cross-referencing of the underdrawing with known preparatory studies. She listened to the careful, qualified, evidence-grounded conclusion that the 7th painting was, within the bounds of current authentication methodology and pending peer review, which Dr. Wren expected to confirm rather than qualify, exactly what she had believed it to be on the day she held it in the doorway. Light of Unit 114. At the end of 6 minutes, Dr. Wren said, "The revised upper estimate, accounting for the authentication and current market conditions, is between $8 and $11 million for the 7th work alone. Total collection revised estimate is between 15 and 22 million." Rosa stayed against the wall. "Are you there?" Dr. Wren asked. "Yes," Rosa said. "I know that's a large number. Yes. It will be some time before you see any of it. The auction process, the institutional sales, the estate finalization, these are not fast. You will be living with this for months, possibly longer." "I know," Rosa said. "I understand how to wait." There was a pause on the other end. When Dr. Wren spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly. The professional distance condensed into something a fraction closer. "Ms. Castillo, I have authenticated a great many things in my career. I have sat in a great many storage units and attics and basements, and seen a great many objects that turned out to be worth more or less than people hoped. In all of that, I have rarely been moved by the circumstances of a discovery." Another pause. This one has moved me. I want you to know that." Rosa pressed her hand harder against the plaster. "Thank you," she said. It came out very quietly. She ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment. So down the hall, through the door of their room, she could hear Lily asking Camille a question about something. The specific words inaudible, the tone bright and ordinary, the sound of a morning that did not know yet that it was extraordinary. Rosa looked at the ceiling of the boarding house hallway and let the number sit in her chest. $15 to $22 million. The contents of a 12x8 storage unit, locked and waiting for 8 years, discovered because a coat had gone to a church sale with a key still in its pocket. She thought about Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux, who had packed her life with care and intention and left a note on a typewriter that said, "Do not be afraid to open things." She thought about an attorney who had handled a small estate for a woman who had nobody and who had chosen to wait rather than accelerate to auction. She thought about Pat at the office window, sliding a post-it note under the glass without being asked. She thought about Camille saying maybe someone put it there. She did not know if that was true. She did not know if the sequence of events that had brought a key to her coat pocket and her coat to the worst days of her life and her body to the doorway of Unit 114 was the product of intention or accident or something in between that did not have a good name yet. She was not sure it mattered. What had happened had happened. What was waiting in that storage unit had been waiting, and she had been the one to come. She pushed off the wall and went back into the room, and Lily looked up from whatever she and Camille were discussing and said, "I'm in the way of a 6-year-old who has learned to read faces from a mother who has become expert at controlling them." "Mama, is something good?" Rosa sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her 2 daughters. Lily bright and questioning, Camille watchful and still, and felt the full weight of what she was about to give them press upward through her chest. "Yes," she said. "Something is very good." Camille looked at her with those careful eyes. "The paintings?" she said. "The paintings," Rosa confirmed. And then, for the first time, she told them the number. Lily did not understand what $15 million meant exactly, and Rosa could see the understanding trying to organize itself behind the 6-year-old's eyes and finding the space too small for the concept. But she understood the expression on her mother's face, and on Camille's face as Camille heard the number and went still with it, and Lily understood that expression because it was one she had not seen in a very long time. Rosa was not crying. She had not cried through the eviction or the shelter or the plastic chairs or the 3 days of nothing, and she did not cry now. But her face had opened in a way that had been closed for so long that neither of her daughters quite recognized it at first. And then Lily recognized it and said, "Mama, you look like you again." Rosa pulled both of them to her, Lily from the left and Camille from the right, and held them in the east-facing room while the morning light came through the window, and let that be the whole of the moment. Not the number, not the paintings, not the auction process or the legal finalization or the months of managed waiting still ahead. Just the 3 of them in the light, the ordinary morning, the radiator silent for once. She had opened what was waiting to be opened. The rest would follow. Outside, the city went about its business with the indifference of cities, unaware that in a boarding house room on Carver Street, a woman who had been evicted with 2 children and a coat with a broken zipper had just learned that she was holding, by the chance of a forgotten key, something the world had lost and she had found. Unit 114 was still locked. The paintings were still wrapped. The process was still in motion. But the truth of what lived inside that storage unit had been confirmed, written in the language of laboratory analysis and professional appraisal and the accumulated weight of 38 years of expertise, and it was real. Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux had collected beautiful things, and she had cared for them, and she had packed them away with intention, and she had written on a notepad that wasn't afraid to open things, and then she had died without anyone to receive what she had kept. And Rosa Castillo, who had nothing, had found a key in a coat pocket at the bottom of the worst year of her life, and she had gone looking for the right person to give it to, and she had waited, and she had been patient, and she had been honest, and she had not taken what was not yet hers, and she had opened what was waiting to be opened. The number was real. The paintings were real. The life that was coming was real. And it was hers. The auction house was called Whitmore and Associates, and it occupied the top 2 floors of a building on a street where Rosa had once cleaned offices at 5 in the morning before the rest of the city woke up. She had cleaned that street for 14 months, pushing a cart from the service elevator to the suites that faced east, emptying wastebaskets and polishing glass and moving through other people's workdays without anyone registering her presence. She had pushed past the lobby of that building hundreds of times in the dark hours before dawn, past the marble floors and the recessed lighting and the paintings on the walls that she had looked at without knowing yet that she had any relationship to such things. She had not thought about it then, and she had thought about the next building and the time on the clock and whether she would make it to Lily's school pickup without running. She thought about it now, standing on that same street in a coat that was not the green parka. The green parka had been folded and placed at the top of a box that sat on the shelf in the room on Carver Street. Not thrown away, not donated, kept. Wearing instead a coat that Holt's assistant had helped her find at a consignment shop when it became clear that she would be having meetings with people who made decisions partly based on what they saw when they looked at her. The consignment coat was charcoal gray and well made, and it fit correctly across the shoulders in the way that clothes fit when they have been constructed with care rather than approximation. She straightened it and went inside. Whitmore and Associates had been recommended by Dr. Wren, who had relationships with the major houses and who had made the introduction with the kind of quiet authority that opened doors that might otherwise have presented themselves as walls. The senior specialist who met Rosa in the reception area was a man named James Faulkner, who had the patrician ease of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms full of beautiful and expensive things and had developed the composure of his surroundings. He shook her hand and led her into a conference room with a long table and a view of the street below, and Rosa sat down across from him and his 2 colleagues and placed her hands flat on the table and felt, for a moment, the ghost of every cleaning cart she had ever pushed through a service entrance. Then she let it go, because it was not useful. And she had learned over the preceding months that the skill she most needed right now was the skill of letting go of things that were not useful. Faulkner had received the documentation from Dr. Wren and had his own specialists review the authentication reports. He spoke about the collection with the careful appreciation of a man who understood both its aesthetic and its market value, and who had learned not to conflate the two, even though they were permanently entangled. He spoke about the 7th painting at greater length than the others, because the 7th painting was the kind of discovery that, in his 30 years, he said, he could count on one hand. He used the word provenance several times. He used the phrase market conditions with the studied neutrality of someone who is actually expressing optimism. He talked about timing and placement and the difference between a specialist sale and a broader evening auction. And he laid out 2 approaches, one faster and one more deliberate, with the specificity of a man who respected that the person across the table intended to understand what she was choosing between. Rosa listened to everything. She asked 7 questions. 2 of them surprised him, she could tell. Not because they were difficult, but because they were precise in a way he had perhaps not expected from the documentation alone. She had been reading. In the week since Dr. Wren's confirmation call, She had spent her lunch hours at the library 2 blocks from the copy center. Camille was not the only one who had discovered the library. Working through everything she could find about art auctions, estate sales, the secondary market for 19th and early 20th century American and European painting. She was not an expert. She would never be an expert. But she had learned enough to ask the right questions, which was different from expertise, and in some ways more useful. At the end of the meeting, she chose the more deliberate approach. The specialist sale, targeted audience, carefully positioned. It would take longer, but the outcomes it produced for works of this quality were, Faulkner said, and Rosa now understood, meaningfully better. She was willing to wait. She had demonstrated a considerable aptitude for waiting. She shook hands again and went back down to the street and stood for a moment in the cold air. The marble lobby was visible through the glass, the same marble she had seen before dawn with a card in her hands. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked away and walked to the bus stop because she had to be back at the copy center by 2. The story got out in the 6th month. Rosa had known it would get out. She had hoped to control the timing, and she had done a reasonable job of it. The auction house was discreet. Holt was discreet. Dr. Wren was discreet. And Pat at the storage facility had the discretion of someone who had spent 17 years understanding that what happened inside storage units was, with very few exceptions, not her business to share. But the authentication of a significant sleeper painting, after 31 years of documented absence from the market, was not the kind of thing that remained contained indefinitely. There were too many people in too many institutions who had been watching for this work, none who had written about it, who had theoretical frameworks built partly around its absence. And when the laboratory results began moving through the academic channels that such results move through, the name Marsh-Devereaux moved with them. A journalist at an arts publication called Holt's office first. Holt called Rosa. Rosa called Dr. Wren, who said, with the serenity of a woman who had seen several versions of this particular situation, that it was time to decide what story she wanted told, because a story was going to be told regardless, and the only variable was whether she was the one telling it. Rosa thought about that for an evening. She sat in the room on Carver Street after the girls were asleep and thought about the difference between the story told about her and the story told by her. She thought about what she wanted people to know and what she wanted to keep. She thought about Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux, who had spent her life, according to everything Rosa had learned of her, in deliberate privacy, who had collected beautiful things and not announced them, who had given loans to museums without attending the openings, who had packed her life away alone with no audience and left an instruction to open things rather than a declaration of what was inside. Rosa was not Eleanor. She had 2 daughters who would grow up in the world that this story shaped. She wanted them to know that the story was theirs to be proud of, not something that happened to their mother while they stood to the side. She called the journalist back herself, without going through Holt's office, and she told the story her way. The article appeared on a Thursday. It was not a small piece. The journalist had understood what she had and had done justice to it. The eviction, the shelter, the coat and the key, the legal process, the authentication, the discovery of the sleeper painting. She had written it with the precision of someone who respected both the facts and the person at the center of them, and she had included enough of Rosa's voice in direct quotation that the Rosa on the page was recognizable as the Rosa who had sat in the folding chair in the corridor outside Unit 114 and asked, "What do we do next?" Rosa read it on her phone at the copy center during her break, sitting on an overturned crate behind the paper storage because there was nowhere else to sit, and she felt the strange doubling of reading about yourself in language that is accurate but belongs to a stranger's perspective, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, like seeing your own face in a photograph taken by someone who sees you clearly. By noon, Holt had received 11 calls. By 3, Dr. Wren had received more. By evening, 2 television producers had emailed the arts publication asking for contact information, and a reporter from a national newspaper had posted a brief version of the story to social media, where it was shared 40,000 times before Rosa knew about it. She found out because Camille told her. Rosa came home from the copy center to find Camille sitting cross-legged on her bed, with Rosa's old tablet in her hands, scrolling through something with the careful intentionality she brought to most things. She looked up when Rosa came in and said, without preamble, "There are a lot of people saying things about you." Rosa sat down on the edge of the bed. "Good things." Camille considered this with her characteristic precision. "Mostly." She turned the tablet around. The social media post had comments in the hundreds. Most were the expressions of strangers encountering a story that had moved them. Variations on, "I'm crying at my desk, and this is what I needed today, and she deserved this." Some were the skeptical parsing of people who encountered all good news with suspicion, asking whether the legal process was sound, whether there was more to the story, whether storage unit finds of this scale were even plausible. A few were the straightforwardly envious commentary of people who had decided, without knowing anything, that luck of this kind was an affront. And some, not many, but present, clustered in the replies of people who apparently knew Rosa, or had known her, or had known of her, were a different category altogether. Rosa read those carefully. They were from people who had crossed her life at various points: a neighbor from the apartment complex, a woman she had worked with briefly at the warehouse, a man she did not immediately recognize, whose profile picture eventually resolved into the face of someone she had once worked beside at the cleaning company. They had left comments that carried, in the specific register of people who had dismissed someone and were now watching that person's vindication play out in public, the quality of recalibration. "She knew about the eviction," one woman wrote. "I used to see her with those two girls on the bus." So I thought, that poor woman. Now I think she was tougher than any of us knew. Rosa read that one twice. She was not sure whether it was generous or condescending, or both simultaneously, and she decided that the uncertainty was probably the most honest response to it, and moved on. There was a comment from a name Rosa recognized immediately, which was the name of her sister's boyfriend in Phoenix, the man who had made clear, without ever saying the exact words, that there was no room. He had written, "Wow, incredible story, family perseverance." Rosa looked at that comment for a long moment. Then she put the tablet down on the bed and she laughed. Not a large laugh, not a performance, but the specific small laugh that escapes when reality is more precisely ridiculous than you could have invented. Camille looked at her with one eyebrow raised. "What?" Camille said. "Nothing," Rosa said. "Just people." Her sister called 3 days after the article. Rosa had expected the call and had decided, in the days between the article and the call, how she wanted to handle it. Her sister's name was Mariela, and she was 4 years older than Rosa, and had always occupied the role in the family's internal geography of the practical one, the one who had made stable choices and was not surprised when other people's choices proved less stable. The relationship between them was not hostile, but it had the faint chill of two people who had arrived at adulthood with different assessments of who each other was. Mariela called on a Sunday morning, which was Rosa's day off, and she was sitting at the small table by the east window with a cup of coffee when the phone rang. She looked at her sister's name on the screen for 2 rings before she answered. Mariela was warm. That was the first thing. Warmly and genuinely warm, without the performance of warmth that sometimes covers its absence. She said she had seen the article. She said she was so glad, that she was so relieved, that she had been worried. She said the girls must be so happy. She said it was an incredible story. Rosa listened to all of this. She did not interrupt. When Mariela finished, Rosa said, simply and without heat, "I called you from the shelter." A silence. "I know," Mariela said. I called you before that, when I knew the eviction was coming. I know. Mariella's voice had changed. The warmth had not disappeared. But it had shifted into something more honest, which was harder. I know I wasn't. I couldn't. You didn't have room, Rosa said. I understand that. It wasn't only the room, Mariella said after a pause. And in those 4 words was a more complete accounting than anything else she could have said, the acknowledgement that the excuse of the apartment had contained other things that were less forgivable than square footage. Rosa looked out the east window. The morning light was the particular gold of a clear November day, thin and specific, the kind of light that doesn't lie about what it illuminates. I know, Rosa said. And she did know. She had known for a long time. I'm not calling this even, she continued. I want you to understand that. I'm not calling it even, and I'm not holding on to it either. I have a lot in front of me right now, and I don't have the energy for either of those things. Mariella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, You were always tougher than I gave you credit for. Rosa thought about the comment from the neighbor on the bus, who had thought poor woman, and then reconsidered. She thought about toughness and what it actually consisted of, which was mostly just the refusal to stop. Not strength exactly, but a specific unwillingness to lie down when lying down felt easier. She was not sure that was a virtue, or simply a stubbornness that had, by chance, led somewhere rather than nowhere. I'm going to call you again, Rosa said, when things are more settled, and we'll talk properly. Okay, Mariella said. Properly, Rosa repeated, which was a word that contained a great deal. Okay, Mariella said again. Rosa ended the call and sat with her coffee and the east window for a while longer, and then she got up and made breakfast for her daughters. The specialist sale was held in the spring. Whitmore and Associates had spent 4 months positioning the collection, individual previews for serious collectors, museum consultations, catalog preparation, the construction of a narrative around the works that was both accurate and compelling, because accurate and compelling were not always the same thing. But in this case, they genuinely were. The story of the collection itself, its acquisition by Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux over decades, the loans to institutions, the private preservation, the 8 years in the storage unit, the discovery had become part of the work's provenance in the living sense, or in the sense of context that surrounds an object and deepens its meaning. The 7th painting led the sale. Rosa was there. She sat in the auction room in the charcoal coat with Holt beside her and Dr. Wren 2 seats down, and she watched the room fill with people who had traveled from different cities and, in some cases, different countries to be present. She recognized, from her months of reading, some of the names on the paddles. Collectors whose collections she had studied in library books during lunch breaks. Representatives of institutions who had corresponded with Dr. Wren about acquisition interest. A man in the 3rd row, who she later learned was a museum director who had written his doctoral dissertation 30 years ago, partly about the period in which the 7th painting had been created. She did not have a paddle. She was not there to bid. She was there because this was the conclusion of something that had begun in a shelter lobby with a key in her palm, and she needed to witness it completely. The auctioneer opened the 7th painting at a figure that would have, 18 months ago, constituted more money than Rosa had earned in her entire working life. The room absorbed the opening bid without drama. This was a room accustomed to large numbers, a room in which large numbers were the native language. And then the bidding began. Rosa had watched auction footage online, had read about the mechanics, had tried to prepare herself for the experience. She had not fully prepared herself. What she had not understood from the footage was the quality of attention in the room, the particular compressed focus of people engaged in a competition they care about, the way the air changed when the bidding accelerated, the specific silence between increments that was not actually silence, but the sound of decisions being made. The bidding for the 7th painting lasted 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she had counted, watching the clock on the wall across the room, needing something concrete to hold on to. 11 minutes from opening to the fall of the hammer, during which the number climbed in steps that grew larger as the field narrowed. 4 bidders to 3 to 2. The museum director in the 3rd row, and a paddle held by a representative Rosa did not know. And then 1. And then the hammer came down with a sound that was smaller than she had expected. A modest crack for a moment of such weight. And the number on the board was $11.3 million. Rosa sat very still. Holt leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "The other works will go next. Are you all right?" She looked at the number on the board. She thought about the shelter lobby and the plastic chairs and the yellow phone sheet and the key and the coat. She thought about Lily saying, "Mama, you look like you again." She thought about Camille in the library with 6 books, and the boarding house radiator in the early mornings, and the east window, and the November light. She thought about Eleanor, who had packed everything with care and left one instruction. "Yes," Rosa said, I'm all right." The remaining 10 paintings sold across the afternoon. 1 went to a private collector. 2 went to institutional buyers. 3 attracted competitive bidding from collectors Rosa recognized from her library research, which gave her the particular satisfaction of seeing knowledge become useful in real time. By the end of the afternoon, the paintings alone had realized $18.7 million. The secondary collection, the china, the decorative objects, the furniture, a portion of the archival documents purchased by a university library, would add considerably more through a separate estate sale the following month. Rosa sat through all of it. She did not leave between works or step out for air or look at her phone. She stayed in her seat in the charcoal coat and watched every paddle and every bid and every fall of the hammer, because this was hers to witness, and she was going to witness it completely. When it was done, Faulkner came to find her. He was composed in the way of a man who had just presided over a very successful afternoon and was making deliberate efforts not to appear too pleased with himself. He shook her hand and said the total was above the upper estimate, which, he said, was not always the case, and that she should feel the full satisfaction of that outcome. Rosa thanked him. She thanked Dr. Wren, who took her hand with both of hers and held it for a moment and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. She thanked Holt, who looked at his hands in the way he always looked at his hands when he was feeling something he did not have the professional apparatus to express, and then looked up and said, with the precision of 41 years of choosing words carefully, that he was glad she had come to his office. She went outside. The spring evening was cold still, the city noisy with its ordinary business. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the building where she had once pushed a cleaning cart through the service entrance before dawn, and she looked at the street and the people and the indifferent city going past, and she stood there for a long time. She thought about deserving. It was not a useful word, she had decided, in relation to what had happened. Deserving implied a ledger in which suffering was currency, and she did not believe in that ledger. Di had spent most of her life refusing to believe in it, because the math never held up, and the world was too arbitrary for currency of that kind to be reliable. She had not found the key because she deserved to find it. She had found it because it was there, and she had been wearing the coat, and the coat had come from a church sale, and the sequence of events had no moral architecture. It was simply what had happened. But she had done something with what happened. She had gone looking for the right person to give the key to. She had waited and been patient and been honest and not taken what wasn't yet hers. She had opened what was waiting to be opened, and she had done it carefully, the way Eleanor had packed her life, with intention, and without rushing. Maybe that was the thing that mattered, not the finding, but what came after the finding. Not the key, but what she had chosen to do with it. She put her hand in the pocket of the charcoal coat and found, as she always found these days, the key to Unit 114. She kept it there still, even though the unit had been emptied and the storage agreement closed and the key returned, technically to Pat, who had pressed it back into Rosa's hand at the end of the last day and said, "Keep it. I think it belongs to you." And Rosa had not argued. It was a small object, heavy for its size, its plastic tag yellowed, the number 114 in faded ink. She turned it over in her fingers, the way she had turned it over in the shelter lobby 18 months ago, and she felt its weight, and she let herself feel it. She moved them in July. The apartment she chose was not ostentatious. She had thought, briefly and almost guiltily, about the houses she had seen in listings, the large ones with yards and multiple bathrooms, the symbols of arrival that she understood she could now afford. She had looked at them on her phone in the evenings and then set the phone down because what they represented was not what she needed. What she needed was something that felt like a life rather than a statement about a life. The apartment was in a neighborhood she knew, not her old neighborhood, where the memories were layered too thickly for comfort, but a neighborhood like it, one where the streets had the comfortable familiarity of a place that has been lived in rather than designed. 3rd floor, 3 bedrooms, 1 for each of the girls, which was something Rosa had promised herself years ago as the minimum standard of motherhood she intended to achieve and had not been able to achieve until now. A kitchen with a window, a living room with enough wall space for several paintings, not Eleanor's paintings. Those were in institutions now, and museum collections and private holdings, where they would be seen by people who would stand in front of them and be moved without knowing the story of the woman who had loved them and kept them. That was right. That was as it should be. But Rosa had kept one thing from the estate, with Holt's guidance on the legality of it and Dr. Wren's approval of the selection. Among Eleanor's possessions had been a small watercolor, not part of the main collection, not significant by the standards of what surrounded it. A simple landscape? No, a field in low light, a line of trees at the horizon, painted with a directness that suggested a private exercise rather than a formal work. On the back, in the same careful hand as the box labels, Eleanor had written simply, "Tuesday morning, June." Rosa had it framed properly and hung it in the living room of the apartment on the wall opposite the kitchen window, where the morning light could reach it. She stood in front of it on the first morning in the new apartment, coffee in hand, before the girls were awake. The field in low light, the trees at the horizon, the particular intimacy of a painting made for no audience but the painter. Eleanor standing in a field on a Tuesday in June, looking at trees, deciding to record the way the light was falling. Rosa looked at it for a long time. She had commissioned a small plaque for the frame. Simple, plain, 2 lines. The first line was Eleanor's name. The second line was the instruction she had left on the typewriter notepad. Do not be afraid to open things. She had put it there for her daughters. She wanted them to see it every day, to grow up with it on the wall, to carry it in whatever came after this. The good years and the difficult ones, the moments when the available options all looked like the wrong ones, the mornings when starting over seemed like the only real option left. She wanted them to know that an old woman had packed her life away with care and waited, without knowing she was waiting, for someone to come. And that someone had come because she had not been afraid to open what was there to be opened. Camille appeared in the kitchen doorway first, and still in her pajamas, hair loose, a book in her hand that she had apparently been reading since before she got out of bed. She looked at Rosa, and then at the watercolor, and then at Rosa again. "I like it there," she said. "Good," Rosa said. "I wanted you to." Camille came and stood beside her, and they looked at it together. The field in low light, the trees, the Tuesday morning in June that Eleanor had decided to keep. "What do you think she was like?" Camille asked. She had asked this before, at various points over the past 18 months, and each time Rosa gave a slightly different answer because her understanding of Eleanor had continued to develop as the collection had been cataloged and documented, and the archive at the university library had been organized. "Precise," Rosa said. She was very precise. Everything labeled. Everything wrapped correctly. Every document in order. She paused. "And I think she was lonely. I think she spent a long time with no one to give things to, and it weighed on her." Camille looked at the watercolor. "But she kept making them. The paintings. She kept collecting." "Yes. So she didn't stop." "No. She didn't stop." Camille absorbed this in the way she absorbed most things, completely, without comment, filing it somewhere for later use. Then she said, "I want to take an art class." Rosa looked at her daughter. "Okay. Not because of the paintings, just because I want to." "That's the best reason," Rosa said. Lily appeared next, running from the hallway with the energy of a child who wakes at full velocity, and she stopped in the middle of the living room and looked at the watercolor and said, all with the uncomplicated directness of a 7-year-old, "Is that our painting?" "Yes," Rosa said. Lily examined it. "It's small." "It is." "I like small things," Lily said, and went to the kitchen to investigate what was available for breakfast. Rosa stayed where she was, with the watercolor and the morning light, and the coffee going cool in her hand, and let herself be fully in the moment, not thinking about what came next, not organizing or planning or calculating, just here, in the apartment on the 3rd floor, in July, with her daughters and a small painting on the wall, and the whole particular ordinary miracle of a morning that belonged to them. She paid off everything first. That was the order she had decided on during the months of waiting, and she held to it. Every debt, the credit cards, the medical bills from Lily's ear infection 2 winters ago that she had deferred, and deferred until the deferral itself had become a kind of debt. The small amounts owed to people who had lent her money in the years before the eviction, with the patient generosity of people who did not expect to be repaid, but hoped to be. She paid them all. She called some of the people herself, the ones she had borrowed from personally, and she paid them, and she thanked them. One of them was a woman named Deirdre, the same Deirdre who had answered her call from the shelter, with warmth kept firmly behind glass. Rosa called her, transferred the $300 she had borrowed 2 years before, and then said, with the equanimity of a person who had decided that settling accounts required honesty as well as payment, that she understood why Deirdre hadn't been able to help more, and that she harbored no resentment, but that she hoped Deirdre understood what it had felt like to make that call. Deirdre cried. That was not what Rosa had expected, but it was what happened, and Rosa sat with it without attempting to manage it, because some things needed to run their course. She set up education funds for both girls, properly structured, with Holt's guidance, indexed to what college was likely to cost in 12 years for Camille and 15 for Lily. She had thought about this specifically during the shelter days, with the particular grief of a parent who can see the door to a child's future and cannot find the key. She did not want either of her daughters to make decisions about their education based on what they could afford. She wanted them to make those decisions based on what they wanted, which was a different set of considerations entirely, and the right ones. She gave to the shelter. She had thought about this carefully too, not a symbolic gesture, not a one-time contribution, but an ongoing commitment to the organization that had given her daughters a warm place to sleep when she had nothing else to offer them. She set up the arrangement herself, going in person to speak with the director, a woman named Cortez, who had the particular competent warmth of someone doing necessary work without enough resources. Rosa sat across from her in the shelter director's small office and explained what she wanted to do and why, without performing the explanation, without making it into a story that required Cortez to respond with the appropriate gratitude. She simply said what she intended, and Cortez said, "Thank you," and Rosa said, "You're welcome," and they shook hands, and that was that. She was not a different person. She had thought, during the months of waiting, about whether the money would change who she was, whether it would make her someone she did not recognize, whether the transformation it enabled would transform her in ways she had not chosen. She had watched it happen to people, the subtle shifts of self-conception that large amounts of money could produce, the way it could make a person inflate toward the limits of what they could now purchase, or deflate toward the anxiety of managing what they had. She was not interested in either direction. She was interested in being, as Lily had said, herself, the Rosa who had cleaned offices in the dark and pushed a cart through a service entrance and sat in plastic chairs for 3 days and reached into her coat pocket and found a key and gone looking for the right person to give it to. That Rosa, with more room to breathe, with her daughters in their own bedrooms and books on the shelves and a watercolor on the wall and the morning light and the coffee and the ordinary miracle of the days. Pat retired from the storage facility 6 months after the sale. Rosa found out through Holt, who mentioned it in passing, and she sent flowers and a note that said, "Simply and completely, you gave me a post-it note when I needed one. Thank you." Pat called her after, and they spoke for 40 minutes, which surprised them both. Bernard Holt received a gift as well, a first edition of a legal text he had mentioned, early in their acquaintance, that he had always meant to read. He called her when it arrived, and she could hear, in the formality he used to express his gratitude, the trace of something he was not professionally equipped to say more directly, which was that she had been the best kind of client, the kind that reminded him why he had spent 41 years doing what he did. Dr. Wren received an invitation to dinner. She accepted. They sat in a restaurant near the university where the authentication had been done, and they talked for 3 hours. Not about the collection, not about the sale, but about painting itself. What it was for. What it did to the people who made it and the people who looked at it. From why human beings had always needed to make marks that would outlast them. Dr. Wren spoke about it with the passion that her professional language usually kept carefully banked, and Rosa listened with the full attention she brought to things she was learning. And by the end of the evening, something had passed between them that was, unmistakably, the beginning of friendship. 18 months after the sale, Rosa enrolled in 2 courses at the community college. Art history was one of them. She had been reading about it since the beginning, since the provenance documents and the museum letters and the long library lunches, and she wanted to do it properly now, with instruction and structure and the company of other people learning the same things. The second course was accounting, because the money she had was not a resource that managed itself, and she intended to understand how to manage it rather than outsourcing all of that understanding to others. The art history professor was a young man who was clearly surprised on the first day to have a student of Rosa's age in the front row with a notebook already open. By the 3rd class, he had stopped being surprised and started being grateful, because Rosa's questions were the kind that made the class better for everyone. She came home from the 1st class in October, 2.5 years after the eviction, and she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open and the watercolor visible on the wall across the room, and she thought about the line of events, the sequence of accidents and choices and decisions and coincidences that had led from a garbage bag and a plastic chair to here. The coat at the church sale, the key in the pocket, the walk to the storage facility on a cold morning with nothing to lose, the decision to find the lawyer for the estate, the waiting, the patience, the decision to open what was waiting to be opened. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her what the lesson was. She was not a person who had previously believed in lessons. She was too practical for the kind of thinking that extracted morals from events, as though life were a text designed to be interpreted. But she had been thinking about this for 2 years, in the way that a significant experience continues to work on you long after its external shape has resolved, and she had arrived at something she believed. The lesson was not that good things came to good people. She had seen too much of the world to believe that. The lesson was not that patience was rewarded, because it was often not, and the people who had been patient and honest and careful and had found nothing were not less deserving than she was. The lesson, as far as she could find one, was this: when a door appears, open it. Even when you are tired. Even when opening it seems foolish, seems like the kind of thing a person in your circumstances has no business attempting. Even when everyone around you, including the voice inside your own head that has learned, from long practice, to protect you from disappointment by discouraging hope, is suggesting that there is nothing behind it worth finding. Open the door, you cannot know what is there until you do. And sometimes, on the other side of a door that everyone else has walked past, in a space that has been waiting in the dark for longer than you know, something extraordinary is sitting in organized rows, carefully wrapped, labeled in a precise hand, with a note on a typewriter that says, "Do not be afraid." Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux had known that. She had spent a life opening things and caring for what she found, and packing it away with the hope that someone would come. And someone had come, not someone she had chosen or anticipated or prepared for. Someone who had found a key in a coat pocket at the bottom of the worst year of her life and gone looking for the right person to give it to, and in doing so, had found herself instead. Rosa closed her notebook. The kitchen was quiet. Through the wall, she could hear the faint sound of Camille's music from her room, something she had been listening to lately that Rosa did not recognize, but that had the quality of something a person played when they are thinking. From the other bedroom, silence that meant Lily had fallen asleep, which happened early and completely in the way of children who had decided that sleep was not to be resisted. Rosa sat in the kitchen of the apartment on the 3rd floor in October, with the watercolor on the wall and the notebook on the table and the key to Unit 114 in her pocket, and she let the evening be simple. She had everything she needed. She had more than everything she needed. Tomorrow, she would go back to class, and the day after that, she would call Holt about the quarterly review of the estate finances, and the day after that was Lily's school performance, where Lily had a speaking part that she had been practicing in front of the bathroom mirror for 2 weeks. Life had resumed its familiar texture of small obligations and anticipated pleasures, the ordinary weave of days that felt, from the inside of the shelter, like a luxury beyond imagining, and from inside the ordinary felt simply like living, which was, Rosa had decided, the point. Not the paintings, not the number, not the vindication, or the article, or the specialist sale, or the charcoal coat. Not even the key exactly, although the key was where it had all turned. The point was this: the ordinary morning, the east window, and the light. Her daughters in their rooms, the watercolor on the wall, the quiet of a life that had room in it for the things that mattered. Eleanor had known something about that too. A woman who collected beautiful things, not to display them, but to keep them, to live alongside them in private, to wrap them carefully and label them with her own hand. A woman who had understood that the value of what you love is not diminished by the smallness of the audience. Rosa looked at the watercolor from across the kitchen, the field in low light, the line of trees, Tuesday morning, June. An old woman in a field, looking at the light, deciding to keep it. She thought, "Thank you. Not to the paintings, not to the money, not to the sequence of chances that had brought a key to her coat pocket. To Eleanor herself, wherever she was, in whatever form the people who have left things behind continue to exist in the minds of the people who have received them. Thank you for packing it carefully. Thank you for the note on the typewriter. Thank you for trusting that someone would come. Someone came." Rosa put her hand in her pocket and held the key, and the kitchen was quiet, and somewhere in the city the ordinary evening continued its ordinary work, and she sat in it completely, unhurried, without the choke of fear or the weight of debt or the particular hollow of a life that has stopped believing it can become anything other than what it already is. She was, unmistakably and entirely, herself, and that was everything. The community college art history course met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, which meant that twice a week, Rosa walked through a campus that smelled of cut grass and old paper and the particular institutional warmth of buildings that had been heated and cooled through too many seasons to remember when they had started. She carried a notebook and a pen and sometimes a thermos of coffee, and she sat in the third row because the third row was close enough to see the projected images clearly, but far enough back that she could take in the whole slide without tilting her head. The professor's name was David Reyes, and he was 34 years old and had the energy of a person who had chosen his subject matter correctly. The kind of contained enthusiasm that appeared in his voice when he moved from the administrative portions of the class into the content itself, a shift as visible as a change of weather. He talked about paintings the way some people talked about living things, with attention to interiority, to what a particular choice of color or composition or light revealed about the person who had made it, what it said about the moment in which it had been made, and the moment in which it was now being seen. Rosa found, to her own mild surprise, that she had opinions. She had not expected to have opinions about art history. She had expected to accumulate information, which was a different thing, to learn the names and dates and movements and place them in the correct relationship to each other, to build the framework that would allow her to understand, more precisely, what she had been surrounded by in Unit 114. That had been the practical justification for the course, and it was genuine. But what she had not anticipated was that the practical justification would be accompanied by something less practical, the discovery that she found the subject genuinely, stubbornly interesting in a way that had nothing to do with the money or the paintings or Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux. She found it interesting because it turned out that paintings were arguments, not in the combative sense, but in the philosophical one, each work a position taken by a specific person at a specific moment about what mattered and how it looked and what the world contained. And the history of painting was the history of those arguments accumulating and responding to each other across centuries, each generation working in the presence of what had come before, either embracing it or rejecting it, or doing both simultaneously in ways that produced something neither the embrace nor the rejection could have produced alone. She had not thought about human endeavor this way before. She had thought about it in more immediate terms: the work in front of her, the bill that needed paying, the child who needed feeding, the next step, and the step after that. She had not had the luxury, or perhaps the permission she gave herself, so to think at the scale of centuries. The course was giving her that, and she was taking it greedily, in the way of someone who discovers light a hunger they did not know they had been carrying. She told Dr. Wren about this at their second dinner, which happened in February, 4 months after the first. They had settled into a rhythm of meeting every 6 weeks or so, alternating between the restaurant near the university and a place closer to Rosa's apartment that had the particular comfort of a room that had been serving the same food to the same neighborhood for 30 years without apology. Dr. Wren ate with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and she listened with the same quality of attention. And Rosa found, in her company, the particular ease of a person who does not require performance. She told her about the argument theory of paintings, the idea that had been forming through the weeks of Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and the reading she did between them, expanding steadily from the assigned texts into the adjacent material that the assigned texts kept gesturing toward. Dr. Wren listened to the whole formulation without interrupting, which was what she always did, and then she said, "Eleanor would have liked you." Rosa looked at her. "She thought about painting the same way," Dr. Wren said. "I met her twice, once at a preview, once at a lecture she attended at the university where I teach. She was already old by then, and she sat in the back and asked one question at the end that contained about 6 questions inside it. And afterward she spoke to me for 20 minutes in the lobby about the relationship between collecting and argument, whether accumulating a collection was itself a position, a set of claims about what mattered." She paused, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. "I think the collection in Unit 114 was exactly that. A life's argument, assembled in wood and canvas and pigment, packed away with the hope that someone would eventually understand what she had been saying." Rosa sat with that for a moment. "Do you think I understand it?" "I think you're learning to," Dr. Wren said, "which is more honest than claiming you understand it already, and considerably more interesting." Rosa smiled. It was the kind of smile that appeared when something had been said precisely right, and she was still learning to let herself smile without checking first whether the expression was appropriate to the circumstances. It was a habit she had developed over the hard years, the careful management of visible emotion, the tamping down of anything that might read as unwarranted optimism in a situation where optimism carried risk. She was working to unlearn it, slowly, in the way that habits formed by necessity are unlearned, not all at once, but in small daily decisions to let the expression through. Camille started the art class in January. It met on Saturday mornings at a studio 3 blocks from the apartment, run by a woman named Luce, who had the brisk patience of a person who had taught beginners long enough to have genuine affection for the particular chaos of early attempts. Camille went the first Saturday with the careful composure she brought to new things, attentive, reserved, watching before committing, and came home 2 hours later with paint on her left hand that she had not noticed and a look on her face that Rosa recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had found a thing. She didn't talk about it directly, which was characteristic. She put her jacket away and washed her hands and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and was quiet for a few minutes, in the way she was quiet when she was organizing something internally. Then she said, without looking up, "I think I want to go back next week." "Okay," Rosa said. "And the week after." "Okay." A pause. "I made something. It wasn't good." First things usually aren't. Camille looked up then. "Lou said the point isn't to make something good. The point is to find out what you're trying to say." She paused again, considering. "I'm not sure yet what I'm trying to say." "That's what the weeks after are for," Rosa said. Camille nodded, satisfied with this, and went to her room. She went back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and by the 6th week, she was staying an extra 30 minutes, because Luce had offered the studio time, and Camille had accepted without asking whether it was allowed, which Rosa considered, privately, a small but significant act of self-assertion from a child who had spent too many years asking permission for things she was entitled to simply take. She did not become a prodigy. Rosa had not hoped for that, and would not have known what to do with it. What Camille became, and over the months of Saturday mornings, was a person who had a practice. A word Luce used that Camille brought home and turned over for a while before deciding she liked it. Not a talent, not a gift, not a hobby. A practice. Something you returned to. Something that required showing up even when the results were uncertain. Something that developed not in leaps, but in the slow accumulation of attempts. Rosa watched this happen with the particular attention of a parent witnessing a child become more specifically themselves. It was one of the quiet gifts of the changed circumstances, the time and space to watch her daughters grow into the shapes they were growing into, without the constant background static of financial fear compressing everything into urgency. She had not known before how much of her attention had been consumed by that static. She had thought she was present. She had believed she was paying attention. But the difference between attention divided by fear and attention that had room to be simply itself was more significant than she had understood until she experienced the contrast. She tried not to feel guilt about the years when she had not been able to give them this. Guilt wasn't useful, and she had decided, with the particular firmness she brought to decisions about her own interior weather, that she was not going to spend the good years grieving the hard ones. The hard ones had happened. They were part of the story. Camille had learned things in the shelter that she would carry her whole life. A specific kind of patience, an ability to read the emotional temperature of a room with the accuracy of a person who had needed to do so for survival, a generosity toward people in difficulty that came from having been one. Lily had learned, without knowing she was learning it, that home was something you carried inside you rather than something the walls provided. These were not lessons Rosa had chosen to give them, but they were real, and they were theirs. And Rosa had decided to trust that the full accounting of what the hard years had cost and given would, in the end, be something her daughters could hold without collapsing under the weight of it. The university library called in the spring. The archivist who had acquired the documentary portion of Eleanor's collection, the correspondence, the acquisition records, or the personal papers, had been working through the material for several months, and she called Rosa to tell her that the archive was now organized and accessible, and to invite her to come and see it before it was formally open to researchers. Rosa went on a Wednesday afternoon, taking a half day from the copy center where she still worked 3 days a week, not because she needed the money now, but because she had decided, with deliberateness, that she was not ready to stop working yet. She was not ready to define herself entirely by what had happened to her rather than what she did. The copy center was ordinary, and the pay was modest, and the work was not complex, but it was hers in the way that work is yours when you show up to it by choice rather than by necessity, which turned out to be a meaningfully different relationship with the same tasks. The archivist's name was Helen, and she met Rosa in the lobby of the Special Collections building and took her up to the reading room, a quiet space with long tables and good light, and the smell of paper that Rosa had come to associate over the past 2 years with the particular pleasure of learning. The archive occupied 6 gray boxes on a shelf, each labeled in the neat typography of institutional care. Helen had pulled several items to show her, things she thought Rosa would find meaningful given what she knew of the discovery story, which she had read about, and which Rosa had confirmed in their preliminary phone call, with the same directness she brought to these conversations now. She had stopped softening the story in the telling. It was a story worth telling fully. The first item Helen showed her was a photograph. It was mounted in a simple frame, clearly pulled from the archive for presentation, and it showed a woman Rosa had never seen but recognized immediately. Eleanor Marsh-Devereaux, younger than Rosa would have pictured her, mid-40s perhaps, standing in front of a painting that Rosa also recognized, one of the works from the collection that had sold at auction, now hanging in an institution in Boston. Eleanor was looking at the painting rather than at the camera, and her expression was the expression of someone absorbed in private dialogue with something they love. Rosa looked at the photograph for a long time. "There are others," Helen said gently. "Throughout the papers. She documented the collection extensively, not just provenance, but her own responses to the work, what she saw in each piece, what had moved her toward acquiring it. It's quite unusual. Most collectors of her generation kept purely practical records." Rosa looked up. "Can I read them?" "That's why I invited you," Helen said. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the reading room, working through the folders Helen indicated, wearing the white cotton gloves that the archive required for handling original documents. Eleanor's handwriting was the same throughout the decades, the same careful script she had used on the box labels and the typewriter notepad, precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a person who believed that legibility was a form of courtesy. She wrote about paintings the way Rosa had come to think about them in the art history class, as arguments, as positions, as conversations she was entering when she acquired them. She wrote about what drew her to specific works and what the experience of living alongside them over time had taught her, how a painting's meaning had shifted or deepened through years of looking. She wrote in one letter to a friend Rosa could not identify about the relationship between keeping beautiful things and giving them away, and whether accumulation was generosity deferred or selfishness rationalized, and how she had never entirely resolved the question. Rosa read that passage 3 times. She thought about the instruction on the typewriter. "Do not be afraid to open things." She thought about it now, not as a directive to Rosa specifically, but as something Eleanor had been saying to herself throughout the years of packing and organizing and labeling. A reminder that the things she had gathered required eventually to be released, to pass from her hands into others, to complete the circuit of care she had begun when she first stood in front of each work and decided it was worth keeping. Eleanor had not been able to give them away herself. Whatever had happened in the last years, the failing health, the absence of family, the slow drift toward the storage unit, and the paid-up rent, and the silence afterward, she had not been able to complete that circuit. But she had left the door open. She had packed everything carefully and written instructions, and paid the rent for as long as she could. And she had left a key in a coat pocket that had found its way to the right pocket at the right moment. Or perhaps not the right moment. Perhaps any moment, with any person who was paying attention. Rosa sat in the reading room with Eleanor's papers and felt, for the first time, the full shape of the relationship between them. Not the transaction of inheritance, not the accident of the key, but something more reciprocal than either. Eleanor had loved beautiful things and not known who to give them to. Rosa had needed something to open and not known where to look. Each had been, in some sense, waiting for the other without knowing it. She thought about what she wanted to do with that. She had been thinking, for several months, about something that did not yet have a clear form. It had started as a vague impulse, unpresent in the background of the days, surfacing occasionally without announcing itself. She had not examined it directly for a while, the way you do not look at something uncertain too quickly, in case the examination collapses it before it has had time to become real. But sitting in the archive reading room with Eleanor's papers in her cotton-gloved hands, Rosa let herself look at it. She wanted to do something with the knowledge she was accumulating, not display it, not perform it, something more useful than that. She had spent 2 years learning about a world she had not had access to before, not because that world had been closed to her by any explicit barrier, but because the sequence of circumstances that constituted her life had never directed her toward it. The art history class had not been difficult. The reading had not been beyond her. The questions she asked Dr. Wren and Holt and Faulkner and Helen were questions she had been capable of forming for as long as she had been capable of thinking carefully, which was her whole life. The access had been the missing piece, not the capacity. She thought about the shelter. She thought about the other women she had sat beside in the plastic chairs. Not all of them, not most of them, but some of them. The ones with the specific look of people who have a great deal of interior life and no current means of directing it outward. She thought about what it had felt like to have that life compressed by fear into pure survival, how the compression had not eliminated the interior life, but had made it inaccessible, like a room you know exists, but cannot find the door to. She thought about Eleanor, who had spent a life collecting things so beautiful they required keeping, and who had died without anyone to pass them to because the people who might have received them had been, through various failures of circumstance and connection, simply not present. And she thought about the distance between those two situations. The woman in the plastic chair with her interior life under pressure, and the collection waiting in the storage unit for someone to come. And how that distance wasn't as large as it appeared from the outside. She was not ready yet to give the thought a name or a structure. She knew enough about the difference between an impulse and a plan to wait for it to develop the specificity that plans required. But she let herself hold it, and she told Dr. Wren about it at their next dinner, signed in the tentative language of something not yet finished. Dr. Wren listened with the full attention she gave to everything. When Rosa finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know some people." Rosa looked at her. "People who have been looking for ways to bring art education into communities that don't have it," Dr. Wren said. "Not charity. I don't mean charity. Programs with real substance, real instruction, the kind that treats participants as people who are capable of the full depth of engagement, not a simplified version of it." She paused. Eleanor gave money to 2 such programs over the years. It's in the archive, if you haven't found it yet. Rosa had not yet found it. She believed, Dr. Wren continued, that the experience of beauty was not a luxury, that it was, in fact, a necessity, that the capacity to be moved by something, to stand in front of a painting and feel it speak to something in you that ordinary language couldn't reach, was as fundamental as any other human capacity, and that denying people access to that experience through the accidents of circumstance or economics was a specific kind of poverty that compounded the other kinds. Rosa sat with this. It was, she recognized, what she had been thinking, in the less articulate form her thought had taken before Dr. Wren put language around it. She would have wanted the money used for something, Dr. Wren said. Not just preserved, not just grown. Used. Rosa nodded slowly. "When you're ready," Dr. Wren said, "I can make some introductions." Rosa looked at the watercolor in her mind, the field in low light. Eleanor standing in it on a Tuesday morning in June, deciding to keep what she saw. She thought about the instruction on the typewriter. She thought about Camille coming home from the studio with paint on her hand and the look of someone who had found a thing. She thought about Lily deciding the radiator's knock was a message and deciding the message was good morning and being right. "I think I'm getting ready," Rosa said. Dr. Wren smiled. The full version, not the professional one. "Good," she said. "That's the right pace." On the last day of October, 2 years and 3 months after the eviction, Rosa took the girls to the museum. It wasn't the museum where any of Eleanor's paintings now hung. That was in another city, and they would go there eventually, but not yet. This was the local museum, on the one that Rosa had passed for years without going in, the way you pass things that belong to a life you are not currently living. They went on a Saturday, all 3 of them, Lily in her red coat, and Camille with her notebook, because she had developed the habit of sketching things she wanted to remember, and Rosa in the charcoal coat with the key in her pocket. They went slowly through the galleries, which was the only way to go through a museum that did justice to what was there. Lily asked questions about everything. Not the art history questions, not the provenance questions, but the immediate, uncomplicated questions of a child who has not yet learned that some responses are more appropriate than others. Why is the lady sad in that one? Why did he paint the sky that color? Is that a real place or a made-up place? And does the painting know we're looking at it? Rosa answered every question as honestly as she could, which sometimes meant admitting she didn't know. And Lily accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has learned that "I don't know" is a real answer rather than a failure. Camille moved more slowly than Lily, stopping for longer in front of specific works, her notebook open, but not always writing in it. Sometimes just looking, which Rosa recognized as the more advanced skill. She had started to look the way Dr. Wren looked, with the quality of attention that was not passive reception, but active inquiry, the eyes doing work. In one of the middle galleries, Lily stopped in front of a landscape, a wide painting, perhaps 4 feet across, depicting a stretch of open country under a sky that was doing several things simultaneously. The clouds moving in the upper register while the ground below sat still and specific in the particular golden light of late afternoon. She stood in front of it for longer than she had stood in front of anything else. "Mama," she said finally, "this one's talking." Rosa came and stood beside her. The painting was talking. Rosa could feel it. The same sensation she had learned to name over the months of Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The sensation of a specific human consciousness pressing forward through the surface of the canvas, making contact across whatever distance of time separated the making from the looking. The painter had stood in front of this landscape and seen something and decided it was worth keeping. And here it was, still keeping it, still offering it to anyone who stopped long enough to receive it. Rosa put her hand on Lily's shoulder. "Yes," she said. "It is." Lily leaned back against her slightly, still looking. Camille came and stood on Rosa's other side, and the three of them stood together in front of the talking painting, while the gallery moved quietly around them, other visitors passing and stopping and moving on. The ordinary Saturday afternoon business of a museum that had been standing here for decades, full of things that people had decided were worth keeping. Rosa looked at the painting and thought about Eleanor. She thought about the field in low light on the wall of the apartment. She thought about Unit 114 and the brown paper and the organized rows and the note on the typewriter and the key in her pocket and the 3 days in the plastic chairs and the walk in the cold and the sliding window and the post-it note and the 41 years of a careful attorney and the 38 years of a passionate appraiser and the 17 years of a woman at a storage facility window who had looked at Rosa's face and made a decision. She thought about all the people who had, without knowing they were doing it, made small choices that accumulated into something larger than any of them had intended. The person who had donated the coat to the church sale. The person who had sewn the pocket deep enough to hold a key. Eleanor, who had packed everything with care and paid the rent as long as she could, and left a note that was, in retrospect, addressed to whoever came. She thought about the conversation she was going to have with Dr. Wren's contacts. She thought about what she was going to build with what she had been given, which was not just the money. The money was the instrument, not the thing itself. The thing itself was the understanding that beauty was not a luxury, and that access to it was not a gift bestowed on the already fortunate, but something that belonged, by right of being human, to everyone who stood in front of it and felt it speak. She was going to do something with that understanding. She was not ready yet to say exactly what, but she was moving toward it the way she moved toward most things. Steadily, with attention, without rushing. In the knowledge that the things worth doing revealed their full shape only to the person willing to stay in front of them long enough. For now, though, There was this. The painting, talking, her daughters on either side of her, the gallery quiet and warm, the Saturday afternoon light coming through the high windows at the angle that made the painted light on the canvas resonate with the real light in the room. The two lights in conversation across the distance of however many years separated the afternoon the painter had stood in that field from this afternoon in this gallery. Rosa stood in it and let it be enough. Because it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything she had not known she was looking for when she reached into the pocket of a coat with a broken zipper and found a small metal key with a plastic tag and the number 114 in fading ink, and decided, with nothing left to lose, to go find out what it opened. She had found out. And it had opened everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.